This is going to continue the procession from political theory to political ideologies, and then looking at some contemporary applications of it as a way of setting up the stuff you're reading in Klein. And so the first presentation you're going to see is this one, and it's going to focus on political ideologies using both Roskin and the political compass tests that you should all have done by now. We're also going to go over a little bit more about the uniqueness of political compass as it relates to the United States. The United States is not the same when looking at ideologies with most other countries, and I'll tell you a little bit about that and why during this presentation. And then, once we're done with this, we're going to go to sort of another presentation, and that is going to introduce you to the political economy issue and climate change, which again are the two big themes that Naomi Klein argues are clashing with each other. And it's a really important conversation, so I'm going to go into a little bit about macroeconomics and talk about the two main sort of philosophical or economic theorists who sort of frame much of today's debate, John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. And then I'm going to sort of give you an assignment that will be due the day after Christmas. I'm running behind. I just finished my grading, so hopefully I'll be more focused. And so, I'm giving you a little more time. I know this is very fast, but we're going to try to stay on schedule. So let's go to political ideologies. Now remember, political theory asks normative questions. Political ideologies are essentially formulas for taking political ideals or normative political beliefs and putting them into policy, into practice, into changing society to conform to the particular interests that we may have in terms of our political ideology. Anthony Downs, who is a very famous political scientist, one of the few political scientists who became super rich, by the way, defined back in the 1960s political ideologies as a verbal image of the good society and of the chief means for constructing it. What that includes are three things. First, an ideology provides an interpretation of the present and how it doesn't conform to some kind of desired future. So that's the first thing an ideology has. All right, we're in a situation right now. It's not what it should be, and I know where it should go. The second step in an ideology is a specific list of specific steps that have to be taken in order to accomplish these particular goals. So, for example, if we want a moral society, well, someone who has a political ideology understands how we're not a moral society and also understands how we can become one, but then develops specific steps to accomplish those goals. The third aspect is it's not just oriented toward political decision makers or political elites, it's oriented toward the masses, meaning it's trying to get everybody to embrace this goal or at least conform to it. And so political ideologies are mass-based, coherent sets of prescriptions, essentially saying, here's the diagnosis, here's how we're going to get better, let's all go get better. So it's the three very important components. It makes it much more concrete than a political philosophy. A political philosophy looks at a world that will never exist, whereas an ideology seeks the world to exist exactly the way a particular ideological group may want it. Often very simply stated. Because it's aimed at the masses, it's aimed for motivation, trying to get people on board, get them engaged. And so they're usually a bunch of very simple steps that people can understand, can actually conceptualize, and can work to achieve. The origin, of course, came from France, as much of our understanding of politics in the modern era comes from. And it essentially comes from the idea during the Enlightenment that you can come up with a very coherent sort of understanding of the world as it is. And so an ideology, De Tracy basically said it's a science of ideas and it's a set of specific steps to get there. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels basically developed a slightly different version, and they called it the fabrication used by particular groups of people to justify their own interests. And so you can see it's a little bit different. The 18th century, early 18th century notion is, hey, it's a systematic, very rational, very thoughtful formulas for how to get to a good world. Marx and Engels say it's a tool used by whoever it is who wants to prevail and win to get the masses on their side. So if you think about Donald Trump as being ideological, which one could argue he is, he's a sort of a corporatist and now a populist. He's basically telling the audiences what he thinks they want to hear. And yet, when we fact check and we find that he's by far the most systematic teller of untruths of any presidential candidate in the modern era, that doesn't matter to his followers because basically he's telling them something that resonates with them. So again, an ideology, according to Marx and Engels, is essentially a coherent set of principles, basically to get us to behave in the way that the elites want us to get to behave. So when you think about ideologies in general, you have to think about two continua, and they're popping up here as I talk. The first is the view on the role of government as it relates to economics. Whether you believe, on the one hand, everybody should be free, economically speaking, that's the right side, the liberal side. On the other hand, you have collective, meaning, we should all work together and be egalitarians. That would be the socialist side. So that's the first question. The second is what's the role of government as it relates to our social lives? Should it stay out? Should it leave us free? That's the liberal side. Should it be collective, meaning government getting us to behave in a moral way or in the way that we want them to behave, to conform to the majority's wishes? That's collective. Those are the two very important scales. And you see there are arrows on either side. For those of you who aren't familiar with scales, that means that the person further over to the left is the most sort of collectivist, and the one furthest over to the right is the most free. And then there are whole bunches of people in the middle, same with social. So those are the two, when we look at these things, as you saw in the political compass, those are the two continua that we look at in terms of what's the role of government in promoting these values. Well, if you take the two scales, which is what we do, you have the economic life, collective, regulate the economy, control the economy, redistribute income, make sure everyone's equal. Then you have the right, hey, stay out. And then you take the personal and social life role of government, whether it's collective up top or liberal on the bottom. You essentially create that very famous quadrant that you now know by going to the political compass test. So let's look at where generally people fall. Let's start where most of us are, and that is over on the right side of the horizontal, the economic life scale, and in the upper quadrant of the social life, meaning the freedom scale, free social life, government doesn't get involved, and you have what can often be coined as modern conservatism. Modern conservatism basically espouses two things: free markets and social order. Now, it's a little unique for the United States, so keep that in mind. But the upper right-hand quadrant are people who want essentially government to be somewhat involved in the social regulation, but not so involved in economics. If you move to the left and you see statism, That's basically saying, sometimes the state needs to be used for everything. And we need to regulate the economy. We need to regulate personal behavior. And so you see all sorts of governments up there and people up there. If you looked at the political compass site in depth, these are people who range from communists all the way to people like the Pope. Believe it or not, the Pope does indeed fall into this quadrant. Below them is modern liberalism. Modern liberalism says, hey, definitely use the government to regulate the economy, but kind of leave government out of personal lives. And that's where some of you probably fell. It's where people like Nelson Mandela, the Dalai Lama, and some on the American left tend to fall. Although on this scale, most Americans tend to be in the upper right. And then finally, down to the right on the bottom is libertarianism, and that's where we don't want government at all. If you go way out to the extreme, you basically get people who believe there shouldn't be any social control at all. We tend to call them anarchists. So if you sort of if you took a look at the political compass site, you probably got this already, but I wanted to make sure that you understood. Let's sort of look now briefly at the United States, and I'll probably show you some more later on in the course. But these are sort of the presidential candidates where they might fall using only the United States. Now, remember, everybody in this quadrant essentially, or in this particular graph, would on the last chart, the one from the political compass, be in the upper right-hand corner. And that's because Americans are a very liberal society. We were founded on the principles of liberalism, as you know. It was an Anglo-liberalism, which was rooted in Adam Smith as well as John Locke. And as a result, we believe, economically speaking, government shouldn't be too involved with government, only when absolutely necessary. But we also believe that government should not be too involved in our personal lives. And as a result, most Americans would fall in that upper right-hand corner that we now call modern not modern conservatism. And people in the rest of the world see most Americans as pretty conventional. But now let's go to this particular graph. And I did this as a rough estimator of the various presidential candidates. And you notice I didn't put Donald Trump on here because Donald Trump really doesn't fit, in large part because Donald Trump doesn't have many positions. And frankly, I don't want to pay any attention to him. But anyway, what you see here is, again, looking at the scale, sort of social liberals on the left, social conservatives on the right, economic liberals below the horizontal line, economic collectivists above the left. And you see Bernie Sanders believes that you should use the government to regulate the economy. That's why he's furthest to the left. That Bernie Sanders is further left than Martin O'Malley and Hillary Clinton and former Governor Lincoln Chafee and James Webb, both of whom have dropped out. But they are far more collectivists than most of or all of the Republican candidates. Now, but they also believe that there are certain social equality things that should be guaranteed, and that's why they're in the upper left, that they do believe government has a role, and the specific issues may be very liberal issues, but they think government should promote certain equality. Now, if you go to the lower right and you see George Pataki in the middle, George Pataki is sort of a moderate Republican who's a pretty rare breed these days, but back when I was your age, there were a lot of them. Things have gotten much more polarized ideologically, but Pataki actually is kind of a centrist. He's a little below the line, which means that, he's a little more conservative. And then you have Chris Christie and Jeb Bush. Scott Walker, who's the governor of Wisconsin, he's dropped out. Carly Fiorina might even be a little further down, I would say. Marco Rubio, Mike Huckabee, Ted Cruz, and Ben Carson. That's roughly speaking where they fall. The reason Ben Carson is further down on the bottom, although I'm not sure it fits perfectly, is that he actually believes very much in government control, but as it relates to a very narrow range of moral issues. Ted Cruz the same way. These are people who are pro-life. These are people who oppose same-sex marriage and believe that Christianity is an important element that should be codified in law and endorsed by government, or at least nurtured by government, we'll say. And so they're the people on the right have sort of important issues that they stress. People up in the left have important issues they stress. Now, what about Rand Paul? Rand Paul is the closest to a true libertarian. Now, in this scale, the libertarian is in the upper right-hand corner. And don't worry about this scale. I just wanted to sort of give you a little bit of sort of context here. Couple concluding thoughts. First, both of those graphs, but particularly the political compass, are what we call spatial graphs. Spatial graphs basically means where you fall within a quadrant is a matter of degree to which you embrace that ideology. And so, for example, Hillary Clinton, if you looked on political compass, you saw she was in the upper right-hand corner, but she was further down, closer to the center than the Republican candidates. So if you're further out in the extremes of each of those quadrants, that means you're more ideologically pure in that belief system. The closer you are to the middle means the more middle of the road you are. And that's a really important element. There are things to consider as well about each of these four quadrants, and you know, in there sort of are things like the assumptions about human nature that each group, each person, or each ideology may make. For example, those who are small L liberal, meaning they believe in freedom, tend to buy the Lockean notion, John Locke's notion, that generally we're all okay, and that the reason we have government is every once in a while we disagree and we need a referee. And so general freedom is the main goal. The ones who are a little further toward the left and down are the ones who believe in social democracy. They believe majorities should rule, but they also believe that people should have protections against oppressive majorities. The upper left people are collectivists who believe that we should use government for whatever we want to use government. And down the right, we should use government for nothing. So again, there are certain assumptions that are made. Those who want to use government as a means of social control in a liberal society tend to buy into Thomas Hobbes's notion of liberalism, that we create government because we're all a bunch of greedy little devils and we are nasty, rotten people who will hurt and kill each other just in the pursuit of our own interest, and so we need someone to protect us from that. And so the assumption about human nature of more conservative people or more collectivists in terms of promoting social order is related to the assumption about human nature. The other thing is the role of the state, that in the United States you will see the difference really is in degree to which we embrace collectivism, either in economics or in social policy. We both embrace it, both liberals and conservatives, but the emphasis that a conservative has in the United States is more on government control of human behavior and less on government control of the economy, and it's vice versa for liberals. Big L liberals, modern liberals. The other thing is history, culture, and experience. In the United States, we never really experienced the sort of influence that we saw from the French Revolution and then the German philosopher Hegel that Europe saw. And that's why European countries, even Great Britain, which is our closest sort of historical partner in the pursuit of a liberal society, tends to be much more collectivist than the United States. And so the U.S., we tend to be, as a country, culturally, historically, experientially, far more sort of likely to embrace complete freedom than virtually anywhere else.